For all the doom and gloom, turnarounds are possible. Sure, they only tend to happen after the core player base has got angry and moved on, but there are rare instances where games actually come back from the brink, where the player base returns, where the ship is set back on course, and where everyone wins. Now, are you new here? Do you want 6 game industry news analysis videos per week? Hit that sub button. Do you want to help us with the algorithm? Hit that like button. Want to see what's going on with our game studio? Our website and the mailing list is down below. With that, cheers, and let's get into the video. No Man's Sky might be the foremost example of this kind of reversal story. In 2015, it was the center of a hype tornado promising an enormous universe full of exploration and discovery. Public anticipation was so fierce that lead developer Sean Murray even appeared on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. And yes, when the late night funny men get involved, I think you know it's getting just a little bit silly. 2016's release was a disaster. The gameplay kinda sucked. The visuals kinda sucked. Features that were talked around weren't exactly there. It was near infinite emptiness. Players tore it to shreds in the reviews and then they moved on. But today, No Man's Sky has completely turned around. Its recent reviews on Steam are 90% positive. Quite the change indeed, and the game's community even crowdfunded a thank you billboard outside of the studio. You see, rather than try to convince players of their plans with roadmaps, PR, and advertising, Hello Games actually just went back to work. The Foundation and Pathfinder updates vastly improved the game, adding in bases and a bunch more. Pathfinder also added in vehicles, while Submarines came with the Abyss. Atlas Rises added a 30-hour narrative adventure to the game and a revamped mission structure. The next update then gave us third-person camera, more customization, 4-person co-op, and a very wide variety of much-needed quality-of-life changes. Freighters, botany, and that's not all. The Beyond update went even further, releasing this August and pretty much being No Man's Sky 2 in all but name. It greatly expanded the multiplayer experience, it overhauled base building, NPCs, the technology tree, and it also added in VR support. And yes, this is how you fix a game. When you break promises, you've already lost people's trust. So the way out is not to promise more. The way out is simply to deliver. Hello Games is a small studio that made a tremendous amount of money after the launch of No Man's Sky. They could have chalked it up as a failure and then just moved on. But they didn't. By having controlled team costs and being their own bosses, rather than cut and run, they were able to stick it out and eventually make things right. And what's interesting is that most studios with a failure on their hands, they wouldn't have the financial opportunity to do this because they're probably a lot larger and are a lot more expensive on a per-day basis, but also they'll have more financial commitments, more commitments to their publisher, the sorts of things that basically mean they wouldn't even have the freedom to actually just go back to work and do what is right. And I think the fact that Sean Murray and the rest of Hello Games chose not to cut and run does actually show the quality of their character as individuals, that they actually did stick by and make things right. Next though, there's a AAA example, one that also shows the importance of focused, experience-centric updates, and that is Rainbow Six Siege, the next comeback story of recent gaming. Siege released in 2015, and it was met with a resoundingly lukewarm response. I mean, its excellent gameplay reveal trailer, you know, the one that had all those fake voice actors on VoIP, you know, Bronson and the boys from Ubisoft, that generated a lot of hype. But the launch was a mess, and while the strategic, you know, high-octane shooting that makes up the core of that experience did feel quite excellent, it was rather bare bones in terms of content. It was hard to recommend, and it was also a technical travesty, with the good gameplay being sabotaged by server problems that basically meant that hit registration was utterly destroyed, which for a game like that pretty much ruined its playability. And with all of that happening to a traditional AAA game, you'd normally think, well, it would be time to cut and run. But oddly enough, no. Ubisoft's commitment to this title should be commended, and similarly, they appear to have also kept For Honor going, of course not to as much success. I mean, many games with launches as weak as Siege, they simply would slink away and die. The Siege team, though, were determined, and their dedication has completely transformed this game into a cornerstone of the competitive shooter market. I mean, at its lowest point in March of 2016, Siege's concurrent player count on Steam was 11,000. Fast forward to March 2018, and that number was 176,000, and Siege has had more than 100k concurrent players since December of 2017. And again, that's just on Steam, not even Uplay. Server issues were dealt with, fan feedback was addressed, a constant stream of updates, new operators, and time-limited events reinvigorated that game. Especially the new events and the playable characters did a lot to shake up the formula and prevent that meta from becoming stale, something that, I think, the Overwatch team could very much have learnt from in their own development process. Really, staleness can be a death sentence for a game like Siege, but by doing those events and by updating their meta and adding in characters in the way that they did so, they basically saved the game. And testament to that, as of December 2019, Siege has 55 million registered users, it's a pillar of Ubisoft's business, and right as of the recording of this video, it has had massive esports success and amazing viewership over on Twitch, and it is one of the largest shooters on the market. All that from something that was basically a dud on launch. Rainbow Six Siege really was an entirely different game to the previous Rainbow Six experiences, and No Man's Sky was a completely new game. What then when you are making a long-awaited sequel to something that was beloved? I think that doing that may just be one of the hardest challenges in game development, especially when you are dealing with a decade of fan expectations. It took Blizzard over a decade to make Diablo 3, and its 2012 launch was a complete mess, and trust me, I know, I was there on launch day. Sales-wise, the game had vastly outperformed expectations. That was great on paper, but D3 was online only, and Blizzard simply could not handle it. Players saw all the downsides of forced online, with little of the benefits even being in existence at that point. Players complained of obnoxious difficulty, frustrating loot mechanics, an unengaging endgame, and a pay-to-win feeling auction house that basically ruined the game's looting system. Mindful of their every voice matters value, the Diablo team pledged to collect as much fan feedback as they could, but even this was somewhat hurt by a thread emerging of Diablo 3 core developers trash-talking the Diablo 2 developers from Blizzard North. And try as they might that original D3 team with that original direction, they didn't really save the game, but they did make some improvements. The difficulty question was somewhat addressed in a 2012 patch, which reduced the intensity of Inferno difficulty and boosted up a bit of power and gear. They gave more loot, they added in Paragon levels, they began to make things better, but the core of the game was still rotten. Enter Loot 2.0. This reduced the volume of items received, but it improved their quality. So instead of dropping a white or a grey item, there was just a 70% chance that the game would instead drop gold. It ensured that every major boss would drop an important item, not a bit of trash, and it skewed RNG to actually improve the odds of a player getting something that they actually needed. They then also added in the new adventure mode to boost up the lackluster endgame, and this was all in service of the upcoming Reaper of Souls. Now, Reaper of Souls was announced in August 2013 to a Gamescom audience that erupted in applause. The team then earned back even more of the community trust, with the deal really being sealed with the death of the auction house, which they announced in September 2013. Reaper of Souls released in 2014, and after 2 years, people were finally ready to fall in love with Diablo 3. Sadly though, this is not a story with a happy ending, as much as it may seem so. While Reaper of Souls had saved Diablo 3, making it a very good game indeed, upper management at Blizzard by that stage had lost faith in the entire Diablo 3 line of products. They instead opted to focus on D4, with the lead of D3 Reaper of Souls starting a new project that of course ended up failing and him leaving the company. And in the process of this, they killed Diablo 3's second planned expansion. In hindsight, this was a tremendous mistake. It's one that just immeasurably damaged the Diablo franchise and the amount of content that it had, and that especially is true in a world where, at roughly the same time, what was Path of Exile doing? It was giving people seasonal updates with lots of content that over time made Reaper of Souls all but irrelevant. Next from Blizzard to Square Enix. Square Enix are another company who pride themselves on the idea of triumph in the face of adversity, but Final Fantasy XIV took this notion a little bit too far. Simply put, Final Fantasy XIV was an utter failure when it launched in 2010. Aghast user reviews pointed out unstable servers, a horrid user interface, awful quest design, amongst many other complaints complaints. The response was so strong that Square Enix actually feared for the future of the Final Fantasy IP. So they called in help. The now revered Yoshi P was called in to save Final Fantasy XIV from the brink, and against all odds, he and his team succeeded. Like Diablo 3, Final Fantasy XIV's failings were born from a team under pressure to repeat success. The team was fresh off the back of 8 years of success with Final Fantasy XI, so they of course wanted to make a new MMO to take advantage of modern hardware. The problem though, as Yoshida soon found out, was that the team had a surprising lack of MMO knowledge. Many only had MMO experience through their work in Final Fantasy XI, and considering MMOs aren't even hugely popular in Japan because of a scarce PC gaming market, they knew little of the changing expectations of that genre. And this led to Final Fantasy XIV version 1, I think best being described as a mismatch of misplaced effort. A flower pot with 1,000 polygons, which was about the same resources taken up by some player characters. This graphical detail actually put considerable strain on hardware at the time, so the game ended up having to be broken into smaller instances to prevent broader issues. But this meant that only a handful of players could be in areas at the same time, and that's not very MMO. It actually reminds me more of, say, the initial Guild Wars 1. Square Enix were also of the mind that any issues in the game could be solved, could be patched further down the line, something that we really have heard a lot more of in this new live service era of video games. Thankfully though, they ended up learning that that would not work for them, and this ultimately meant that the game's structure at its base launch was too flawed to be fixed without a complete overhaul, which Yoshida and co were given 2 years to complete. And the crazy thing is, the crazy, impossible thing is, that they did it. Yoshida stressed that rebuilding Final Fantasy XIV was a step-by-step process, and that building a strong relationship with the community would be vital. So to do this, he did something remarkably honest. He got in front of the camera with his letter from the producer series, and he opened up a personal conversation with fans. This idea came directly from him, as Square Enix were actually afraid of player expectations and they wanted to protect themselves. This approach, Yoshida argued, closed the dev team off from their fans and ultimately hurt the game. And if you want to take a more modern Western example of this problem, I would actually say World of Warcraft, a game that doesn't have nearly enough communication and certainly has issues with the developers really feeling rather out of touch with the core player base of the game. And for Final Fantasy, the result of all this hard work and honesty was A Realm Reborn, the culmination of Final Fantasy XIV's redemption. Yoshida's team had rebuilt the game with an infrastructure that could actually handle it, and they introduced a new narrative focus. The game really was saved, and as of December 2019, it has an impressive 18 million registered users, and that just shows us that since its launch, it has grown from strength to strength, with each expansion seemingly besting its predecessor, to the point where many people actually consider the Shadowbringers expansion to be among the best Final Fantasy content ever made. Not just in MMOs, no, the entire Final Fantasy franchise. That really is a crowning achievement for that team, and it's amazing that that all stemmed from a game that launched in such a bad state that it basically wasn't even a viable product. There are of course other examples, honorable mentions. I mean, Battlefront 2, the second Battlefront 2 that is, seems to be an EA-owned comeback story. Something that really is rather surprising, isn't it? As to whether, say, Anthem will be another EA comeback story, well, we're probably going to know in a year. There's then The Division, that's another notable example, and sure, it did not reach Siege-like heights, but by the time patch 1.81 rolled around, it was a far better game, to the point where many players actually felt that Division 2 was often a downgrade to the patched version of Division 1. And you know, this is actually a funny trend for live service games. It's one we saw with Destiny, where Destiny 1 was great by its conclusion, only for Destiny 2 to come in, to simplify systems, to streamline content, and sort of fail for it. Only for Destiny 2's live team to then embark on the same journey that they did for Destiny 1. It's quite an interesting situation, and Bungie do seem to understand the problem there, with their big post-Activision PR push all being about them adding depth and complexity for players. Past that though, there's other series which are worth mentioning, such as Resident Evil 7 responding to 6's problems, and in the process, totally revitalizing that series. So, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. A bit of positivity, some good things, and I hope that it does show that that comebacks are actually possible even for AAA games. That seems to be a more and more understood thing, though, and perhaps it's, well, okay, perhaps it's less for the sake of making good games and more because of the continual failure that's not really been sustainable for parts of the industry. I mean, Ubisoft sure did learn their lesson with Breakpoint. EA sure were burned with Anthem, something that actually combined with Respawn Entertainment's successes with development have led to EA really seemingly thinking or rethinking how they actually go about making games. So there is good stuff there. And what I'd want to know is, what are your favorite turnarounds, right? What are the indies that I don't know about but have maybe had a great turnaround story that you know about? You know, what are the teams that you've seen do something incredible? We would love to hear down below. So let me know down below. Thank you for watching this video. Check out this one, and I will see you next time.